Hello and welcome to another edition of I will try and explain to you some fairly complex ideas in hopefully less than 5 minutes. Today's episode will be looking at the American and French revolutions and a little bit about what they have to do with Britain and how Britain reacts with it. And that's kind of what we're looking at today. The important thing to realise about British Empire building is that it's not really sure what it's doing. The British Empire is somewhat haphazard. It's not directed. It goes all over the world and looks at all sorts of things, which is why the British Empire is all over the place, at least in the first British Empire. We have two British Empires. This is the first one. What is important to note is that much of it is built upon an idea called mercantilism. And mercantilism is this idea that there is a finite amount of gold or finite amount of wealth in the world. And that if you want to grow, you have to grow more or less at the expense of somebody else. So if you want some of that money, you have to go and take it from somewhere else. And so this is how mercantilism works. If you want to expand, you've got to chase other people. And this is this is how we start. And so what happens is that groups of merchants form together charter companies or corporations. These are very capitalistic endeavors. You might think of the first colony in the United States is formed around one of these charters. These are capitalistic ventures where you go overseas and gain, hopefully, money and wealth, and you can channel it back. And, of course, the Crown would take some of it. It's important to note that the areas that Britain conquers aren't really controlled in the same way that many other people control their colonies. So, for example, the British like to take over America, but they don't really control America. They don't rigidly control it, and this is going to be cause for problems later on. What is going on in America? Well, many of you will be familiar with the American side of the story about how and why there is an American Revolution. And I'm not really going to go into too much detail about this. I will point out that America, or at least the Americans, feel they are generally neglected, that the American population is rising, and all of this creates a certain amount of pressure. And that pressure will escape through a couple of major incidents. The first one, the most famous one, being Lord North's Tea Act. Now, of course, as all Americans know, Americans can't drink tea. They don't know how to brew it, and that's why they threw it in the Boston Harbor. It really comes about because Americans didn't really want to pay for tea. They kept smuggling it in, and it was the smugglers and a group of people around that who were fed up with Great Britain trying to foist tea on them, and so that sort of causes a problem. That expands a little bit later on, and of course there are a couple of major incidents like the 1775 insurrection in Massachusetts, but what really happens is in 1776 Thomas Paine puts forward writes a book called Common Sense. And this focuses many of the rebel sentiments on here. And this is quickly followed by the Declaration of Independence. And, of course, the Americans run riot with this. There's a huge fight between England and the Americans, or the British in America, more correctly speaking. This is all contained by Britain until 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga, where the French finally fund the Americans, and the Americans then have enough money to be able to do the things that they need to do, which is to throw off the shackles of oppression. And that's why we end up with America and all of that kind of jazz. Part of the reason why Britain loses America is because they're actually more interested in things that are going on. As we said, Britain lost in the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, but really part of the reason for that is that the British were somewhere else. Mostly their navy was in the Mediterranean, and so that's why they didn't really win anything. But what's going on at home is more important. John Dunning, a Minister of Parliament, passes a vote in Parliament where he says, quote, "Influence of the Crown had increased, is increasing, and ought to be diminished," end quote. And this is part of the concern that the British Crown was getting too powerful. So there are concerns at home about what's being done by George III and others. There are also the Gordon Riots, and the Gordon Riots are, the British don't like Catholics, or hadn't liked Catholics, but as they began to go on, they began to realise that there are a number of rules on the rule books that really weren't that helpful. They penalised Catholics for doing things, but nobody was taking care of this, so they decided to get rid of these rules and abolish them. And Lord Gordon got a bit afraid about this, and so there were a couple of riots. Lots of people had a riot in London. They stormed Newgate Prison. They broke it out. All of these things made people nervous. So at the time, what we have is, at least on the political side, Lord North tries to reconcile with Lord Rockingham, who is the leader of the Whig Party. And the Whig Party kind of said, all right, well, we'll work with you if you are going to allow the Americans to have their independence, which is, of course, very important for Americans. But they also wanted things like economical reform and the dismissal of the leading ministers. So Lord North wasn't having anything of that. He decided that he was going to call a general election, and he wins that general election, which is good news. But Lord Cornwallis over in America is fighting the Battle of Yorktown in 1781 and loses it. And so in 1782, Henry Conway votes to end the war, and that really is the end. And then from then on, British and Americans are the bestest of friends. Other events which are very important are the things that are taking place in and around France. You might remember a small thing called the French Revolution. Initially, it was hailed as a success by Charles Fox. Charles Fox was actually the leader of the Whig Party in the House of Commons, and he would often turn up to debates, or at least on one occasion, turned up to debates dressed in an American military uniform, especially when it came to debates about American independence. Anyway, he came along and said, quote, "How much the greatest event that has ever happened in the world, and how much the best." He was opposed by somebody at the time, a man called Edmund Burke, who you may be reading about in your textbook, who predicted tyranny and terror, and he was quite right in this. The French Revolution did turn into tyranny and terror. But at the time, he was opposed by a number of people. We've already mentioned Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was very unhappy with him, and also Mary Wollstonecraft. You might remember her, or maybe you don't, but she is the mother of the author of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley. All of these people are arranged against what's happening. At least some people think that it's a fantastic thing. Other people don't. And as they begin to go, as the French Revolution trundles on, they begin to realize that this actually is maybe not such a good thing. And this leads to a lot of political reform. Fear. There is a fear that no longer is it the king that's the most important problem, but it's actually the people who are the biggest problem. How do you stop the power of the people exploding like an egg in the microwave? So people begin to explore different ways of alleviating the problems. So this is the American Revolution. For Americans, it's very important. For British people, it's less important. There are other things that are much more closer to home. And so this is the American and the French revolutions in hopefully less than 5 minutes.